Madhava Kunda Bihari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunda Bihari Gopindana Bala Bhagiri Varadari Gopindana Bala Bhagiri Varadari Yashodanandan Vajradana Dandana Yashodanandan Vajradana Dandana Samunatira Vanachari Samunatira Vanachari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunda Bihari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunda Bihari Kunda Bihari Jayom Vishnupad Paramahamsa Parivrajacharya Astatar Shata Shrimad His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada Ki ISKCON Founder Acharya Srila Prabhupada Ki Jayom Vishnupad Paramahamsa Parivrajacharya Astatar Shata Shrimad His Divine Grace Srila Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Goswami Maharaj Prabhupada Ki Ananta Koti Vaishnavinda Ki Namacharya Saharidas Thakur Ki Premsako Sri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Sri Veda Gadadhar Sri Vasadi Gaur Bhaktabinda Ki Sri Radha Krishna Gopa Gopinath Shamakunda Radhakunda Giri Govardhan Ki Vrindavan Ki Navadvip Mayapur Dham Ki Jagannath Puri Dham Ki Ganga Maya Ki Yamuna Maya Ki Tulasi Devi Ki Bhakti Devi Ki Samaveda Bhaktabinda Ki Gaur Premanandi. Oh, glorious the assembled devotees. Oh, glorious the assembled devotees. Oh, glorious the assembled devotees. Oh, glorious to Shri Guru and Gauranga. So, we're given 3 verses to talk about because the first 2 don't have purports. So I usually chant the verse that has the purport. So I'll just chant the other 2 verses first and read their translations, and then we can chant 35, which is the one with the purport, together. So we're reading from the 3rd canto entitled The Status Quo, Chapter 16, the doorkeeper's Jai and Vijay cursed by the sages, text number 33 through 35. Does this work out with this computer? Is it blocking me from the camera? Okay. So, Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. So I'll read 33. Totu Girvana Rishabhau Dustradari Kata Hatashriya Brahmashapada Abhutam Vigata Smayao. Translation. But those doorkeepers, the best of the demigods, their beauty and luster diminished by the curse of the Brahmanas, became morose and fell from Vaikuntha, the abode of the Supreme Lord. 34. Tada Vikunta Dishanat Tayor Nipatamanayo Hahakaro Mahan Asid Vimana Kriyeshu Putraka. Then as Jain Vijay fell from the Lord's abode, a great roar of disappointment arose from all the demigods who were sitting in their splendid airplanes. And today's verse 35, which we'll chant together. I'll go through the word meanings. Tau, those, Eva, he, Aduna, Praptau, Parshada, Pravarao, Harehe, Ditehe, Tatara, Nivishtam, Kashyapam, Tejaha, Ulbanam, Taveva Yaduna Praptau, Parshada Pravarao Harehe, Titer Tatara Nirvishtam, Kashyapam Teja Ubanam, Taveva Yaduna Praptau, Parshada Pravarao Harehe, Titer Tatar Nirvishtam, Kashyapam Teja Ubanam, Taveva Yaduna Praptau, Parshada Pravarao Harehe, Diter Tatara Nirvishtam, Kashyapam Teja Ubanam, Teja. Anybody else? Guess not. Tau, those two doorkeepers. Eva, certainly. He, addressed. Aduna, now. Praptau, having gotten. Parshada Pravarao, important associates. Harehe, of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Dite, of Diti. Jatara, womb. Nivishtam, entering. Kashyapam, of Kashyapa Muni. Tejaha, semen. Ulbanam, very strong. Translation. Lord Brahma continued, those two principal doorkeepers of the personality of Godhead have now entered the womb of Diti, the powerful semen of Kashyapa Muni having covered them. So Brahma is speaking to the demigods who were inquiring what was going on, because Diti was having this pregnancy that was causing all kinds of universal maladjustment. So they went to Brahma, what's going on here? The universe is messed up. And he was explaining. So we'll repeat. Lord Brahma continued, those two principal doorkeepers of the personality of Godhead have now entered the womb of Diti, the powerful semen of Kashyapa Muni, having covered them. Purport by His Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami, Srila Prabhupada. Here is clear proof of how a living entity coming originally from Vaikuntha Loka is encaged in material elements. The living entity takes shelter within the semen of a father, which is injected within the womb of a mother. And with the help of the mother's emulsified ovum, the living entity grows a particular type of body. And this connection is to be remembered that the mind of Kashyapa Muni was not in order when he conceived the two sons Hiranyaksha and Hiranyakashipu. Therefore the semen he discharged was simultaneously extremely powerful and mixed with the quality of anger. It is to be concluded that while conceiving a child, one's mind must be very sober and devotional. For this purpose, the Garbhadam Samskar is recommended in the Vedic scriptures. If the mind of a father is not sober, the semen discharge will not be very good. Thus, the living entity wrapped in the matter produced from the father and mother will be demoniac, like Hiranyaksha in Hiranyakashipu. The conditions of conception are to be carefully studied. This is a very great science. Om Jnana Timirandasya Gyananjana Shalakaya Chakshurunalitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namah Namo Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prasaya Bhutale Shamiti Bhaktivedanta Swaminiti Namani Namaste Saraswati Devi Gauravani Prachayani Nirvasesha Shrunivadi Pastyatya Adeshtani Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Vedagadadhara Shri Vasadi Gaur Bhaktivinoda Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama Hare Panchakalpatarubhyascha, Kripa Sindhubhyascha, Patitanam Pavanebhyo, Vaishnavebhyo, Namo Namaha. Some people chant the whole Mangal Charana before giving class. Apparently Prabhupada says that if one chants the Mangala Charana before he does something, it will become perfect. So I chant the Mangala Charana when I get up in the morning and take a shower, so I feel once it's good for the whole day. And Prabhupada didn't chant the whole Mangala Charana either, so I don't feel obliged. But he did chant the whole Jai Om prayers, which some people don't do, but he did. Because in those prayers actually you remember all these great acharyas, and you also remember the Supreme Lord. And by remembering such great personalities, our endeavors become successful. So, the first two verses without purports, we can say a little bit about them. So they became morose as they fell from Vaikuntha. So this is not a surprise, because Vaikuntha is the eternal abode of the Lord, full of knowledge and bliss. Shri Radha Govinda ki jai, Srimad Mahaprabhu ki jai. And they came to the material world, which is full of misery, full of ignorance, and temporary. So it's not a surprise that they became morose. It mentions that beauty and luster is diminished by the curse of the brahmanas, so that also comes up other places in the scripture. Then the next verse, as they fell, a great roar of disappointment arose from all the demigods. So that's also not a surprise, because the demigods, they're in the mode of goodness, so they want the best for everyone. And they want everyone to go back to Godhead. They don't want people to fall out of Godhead and come back here. So they're seeing these people fall on Vaikuntha. They felt sorry for them because they're Vaishnavas. Some of them are pure Vaishnavas, and some of them are mixed Vaishnavas, but they're all devotees, the demigods, and therefore they feel bad to see people suffer, unlike the lowest of the demons who make plans to make people suffer. So, today's verse, Prabhupada makes different comments in the purport. The first couple sentences he talks about how the living entity takes shelter within the semen of the father, is injected within the womb of the mother. This is described a little bit in detail in by Lord Kapila later in the third canto, in chapter 31. The personality of Godhead said, that's Lord Kapila Dev, under the supervision of the Supreme Lord and according to the result of his work, the living entity, the soul, is made to enter the womb of a mother through the particle of male semen to assume a particular type of body. On the first night, the sperm and ovum mix, and on the fifth night, the mixture ferments into a bubble. On the 10th night, it develops into a form like a plum, and after that, it gradually turns into a lump of flesh or an egg, as the case may be. In the course of a month, a head is formed. At the end of 2 months, the hands, feet, and other limbs take shape. By the end of the 3 months, the nails, fingers, toes, body hair, bones, and skin appear, as do the organ of generation and other apertures in the body, namely eyes, nostrils, ears, mouth, and anus. So this is actually revolutionary knowledge, because if we accept the traditional date of the Bhagavatam, which is 5,000 years old, how would people know these details about how the embryo is being formed? They can't look into the womb, and they didn't do test tube babies then. They didn't have microscopes who could see things that small. So how did this knowledge come to be? But of course, the Supreme Personality of God is omniscient, and He's the witness of all embryos being created, and He's is actually making it all happen. And one time I had to give a class on one of those 3 verses, and I decided I would look up online the embryology, and they give pictures of what the embryo looks at different stages, and it exactly matches the Bhagavatam. So there is real science in the Bhagavatam, and people can do experiments to show that different scientific statements in the Bhagavatam are true. So later in the purport, we learn some more about the subtle science of how conceiving a child in a certain consciousness has an effect on the embryo that's produced. And that in the Vedic culture, therefore, they had a sanskar called the Garbhadan sanskar that would ensure the conception of a good child, a child with divine qualities. So, if you search the folio for the Garbhadan Sanskar, you see mostly when Prabhupada talks about it, he talks about how it's not followed in this age. There are some different samskars that are followed. Generally they follow the marriage samskar, and they follow some of the other ones. But that they don't take this one very seriously, and therefore everyone is born Shudra, because they don't actually follow the samskars. Sometimes people in India, they're proud of being born Brahmanas, but actually because their parents didn't follow the samskar, they're not actually born Brahmanas. And so they're actually an illusion. And they're also an illusion thinking that Brahmanas are produced only by birth. But as Krishna says, Chatur Varna Maya Shrishtam Guna Karma Bhavagasha, He's created the 4 divisions of society according to guna, which is quality, and karma, which is work. And in the Bhagavad Gita, chapter 18, text 42 and 43, he lists the gunas, the qualities of the Brahmanas and Kshatriyas. And in text 44, he lists the work of the Vaishyas and Shudras. So, so one thing that we learn here is that there's a subtle effects in the mind can produce gross effects in matter. So the consciousness, just how the man is thinking when he engages in the act of sex, actually has an effect on the child that's produced. So this actually could be studied because in the Hare Krishna movement, Srila Prabhupada gave a recommendation for a Garbhadan Sanskar that the husband and wife chant 50 rounds of the Hare Krishna before they conceive a child. So you could actually do a study of children who were produced using this Garbhadan Sanskar and children who weren't. And you could measure different things about them, like you could see how many of them take up chanting Hare Krishna as a regular practice, how many come to the stage of initiation, how many of them take Brahman initiation, how many of them become sannyasis. And you could gain some empirical evidence showing that the children who were produced by parents who perform the Garbhadan Samskar have more divine qualities. And then you could inspire people to actually engage in this samskar. So that could be useful if you're a social scientist. It's an opportunity. Hare Krishna, welcome. Prabhupada talks about the Garbhadan Sanskar in this purport, and his main point in his books or lectures when he talks about it is it's not followed in this age, and therefore everyone's born Shudra. But I was saying that people could do a study of the children who are born in this movement, of parents who did the Garbhadan Samskar and who didn't, and see if they have greater divine qualities. And this way they could give empirical evidence for the value of doing it. So subtle things in the mind actually produce gross effects in the body. And the there's empirical evidence for this idea that impressions, at least impressions in the subtle mind of the person, affect the body that's produced. There's one scientist, Ian Stevenson, who studied children who remembered previous lives. And he would ask them many questions, like maybe 50 questions about this personality whose life they remembered, and then he would try to find out who that person was, and he was like successful in over like 60% of the cases. And there were some cases where people, they remembered being murdered in the previous life. And then when they looked up the autopsy records, in the new life, the child had birthmarks that corresponded to where the bullet marks went into the body of the previous body. So we understand when transmigration happens, it's not just the soul that transmigrates, but the subtle body also transmigrates. So that indicates that from this gross effect on the gross body, an impression was made in the subtle body, and then when the new body was created in the next life, that impression was made into the new body. So that shows evidence of subtle effects becoming gross effects like that, and it also gives more evidence of the reality of reincarnation. So Prabhupada advises in this purport that conditions of conception are to be carefully studied, and this is a very great science. So it's something that could be done. In this culture, people have no knowledge of this, and therefore basically they are not concerned about the quality of their mind at the time of conception. And therefore, so many children who have demoniac nature are produced, and therefore there's so much chaos in society. And so this is actually a practical way of improving society, to introduce this Garbhadam samskar. But for people to understand its value, they need to understand, about the existence of the soul and the subtle body and the gross body, and how it works. But you can see, if you were parents, it would be, from the practical point of view, it would make sense to follow it, because then your children would be more likely to be well behaved, and you would have an easier job of bringing them up, because they spontaneously have some divine qualities which would make them inclined. And it's interesting, there's some social scientists who have studied the Hare Krishna movement, and somebody was speaking about one of their studies in the Bhagavatam class, and he said that among the Vaishnav youth that he questioned, people who were born in devotee families, he asked them how many of them accepted Krishna as God, and how many accepted Prabhupada as his representative. So it was like 83% accepted Krishna as God, and 84% accepted Prabhupada as his representative, which was interesting, because if you just take a group of random people in New York and you ask them that question, very few people would accept Krishna as God, and very few people would accept. And even if you took like all the people who were initiated by Prabhupada and ask them now, 40 years later, if they're still alive, how many of them accept Krishna as God and how many accept Prabhupada as representative? Because so many people went away from the practice. I wonder what that percentage would be, So these people who were born in devotee families, they have a lot going for them because of the consciousness they have coming in to the devotee family, and then because they're socialized in growing up with devotees around them, they have a much better shot of actually dedicating their lives to Krishna, because for these two things, to the consciousness they come into the world with and how they're socialized. So, do you remember anything else that Prabhupada said regarding the Garbhadam Samskar, Maharaj? Yeah, that's a big subject, and I'm not really sure that I have, all the knowledge to do a good job of that. But if you want to talk about that now, we haven't talked about it yet, and it's a relevant thing.
Yeah, here Prabhupada says in the first line, here is clear proof of how living entity coming originally from Vaikuntha is encaged in the material elements. And there are people who claim that no one falls from Vaikuntha. Actually, there was an entire book written by two devotees who said not even the leaves fall from Vaikuntha. And there are people even in ISKCON, even in the higher ranks of the GBC, who feel that that is correct, that we can't fall from the spiritual world. There is a verse, I forget where it is exactly, that where Prabhupada says, therefore no one ever falls from Vaikuntha. However, when Prabhupada was asked directly, he said that we do, that although we fall, in one sense we don't, because it could be given the analogy of if you are asleep in your bed here on the 4th floor in Radha Govinda Mandir, and you're dreaming you're in Chicago, are you in Chicago? Well, in your consciousness, you certainly believe you're in Chicago, but your body never left.
Right.
And so similarly, when somebody imagines they're in the spiritual world, it's an illusion. They're still in the spiritual world, but their consciousness is immersed in what we know of as the material world. So Prabhupada explained that one time, that a person who is dreaming that they're being eaten by a tiger, there's actually no tiger, but they're experiencing that distress that's involved. So in one sense, we don't fall from the spiritual world, but I think that's not the sense most people mean. You know?
Right.
They say that the living entity comes from the Brahma Jyoti. And so the interesting thing is that if you accept that view, then immediately certain problems are there in our philosophy. Essentially, if we come from the Brahma Jyoti, you have to explain then that it's not our fault we're here, because we came from the Brahma Jyoti. We were already not in the spiritual world. So we are not going back to the spiritual world. We're working our way up to the spiritual world for the first time. And the strongest point is that Prabhupada called his magazine Back to Godhead. He didn't call it Up to Godhead. He called it Back. And back is a preposition that is only used when something is returning to position it once had before. You know? And it's not just that turn of words, back to Godhead. We hear numerous, if you look in Prabhupada's Veda base about the way Prabhupada explains Krishna consciousness, he's always using words or, clusters of, words, strings of words, which indicate returning to our original position, going back home, back to Godhead, going to our original situation, the original consciousness of the living entity.
Right.
So it's not just a fluke of Prabhupada misnaming back to Godhead. It's shot through and through our philosophy. I've heard people claim that somewhere in the, Jaiva Dharma or somewhere in one of the Acharya's books is this explanation of how we come from the Brahma Jyoti. But I've never heard anybody give me an actual, verse reference somewhere or a page reference. I've never heard that. And it is true that the living entities do come from the Brahma Jyoti, but not in the ultimate sense. I always use the analogy that if you're standing on Bond and Skimmerhorn and you're watching people come out of that subway tube at, Hoyt Skimmerhorn, you could ask the question, where is this flood of people coming from? And someone could truthfully answer, they're coming from the subway. And they are. However, that's not their ultimate origin. They were somewhere else in New York before that. Maybe they were, in Queens, or they were in Manhattan or something like that. And now the subways let them out and they're coming out. So in a similar way, I think of the Brahma Jyoti as kind of a subway system of the world, of the universe, where living entities are emanating from Krishna. I think ostensibly, where are they emanating from? They're leaving the spiritual world and they're entering the material world, somewhere in the material world. So Prabhupada was once asked the idea directly, do the living entities come from a relationship with Krishna? Which is the question we really want to know. And there's a whole writing by Dhruta Karma where he says, yes. Prabhupada replies, yes, they come from a relationship with Krishna. So the quandary is, well, how could somebody give up a relationship with Krishna and come to the material world? Why would somebody do that? It seems to fly in the face of logic and reason. But the simple answer is that we have free will, not just in the material world.
Right.
All living entities have free will, always, everywhere, at all times. The living entities in the spiritual world simply do not misuse that free will, but it's there. And it's not that Krishna forces somebody out of the spiritual world. He doesn't cause them, nor is the living entity got a tendency to go into the material world, in the spiritual world, because there's no such thing as karma in the spiritual world. However, there is this possibility of thinking, why does Krishna have to be at the center? And that is the misuse of free will, and that earns our way into the material world. As the verse goes, Krishna bahir mukha hanya bhoga vanchakare nikatasta mayatara japati adhare, that the living entity, turning his face away from Krishna, the material energy slaps him down into the material world. So some say that Bhaktisiddhanta Sarasvati Thakur said that we come from the Brahma Jyoti, and indeed he does. But I believe what he's referring to is this idea of the living entity being in the Brahma Jyoti, already having fallen from a position in the Leela of Radha and Krishna, and then they come into the material world. Because there's so many problems that come from accepting the idea that the living entity starts off somehow or another. First of all, we wonder then, if we start off in the Brahma Jyoti, Prabhupada said the Brahma Jyoti, you can't fall from the Brahma Jyoti. The Brahma Jyoti, you're already fallen. So if you're in the Brahma Jyoti, you're already not in the highest position. And therefore, if we start off there, we didn't make a mistake. We were placed there by the Supreme.
Right.
And so if we were placed there by the Supreme, then it's not our fault we're there. And they mentioned something about the living entity has the ability to come out of the Brahma-Jyoti and either decide to go to the spiritual world or the material world, which also has its problems, because then we have to answer what idea or what factor causes the living entity to come out of the Brahma-Jyoti. At what point does that happen, you know? And essentially we're saying that if the living entity is origined at the Brahma-Jyoti, he was there since time immemorial, because the living entities are immortal, and not only in the forward space of time, but also in the previous space of time. So if the living entities are also eternal backwards, that means since time immemorial they've been in the Brahma-Jyoti. And what event caused them to come out of the Brahma-Jyoti? There's numerous philosophical problems with that view, you know. So it's not just Prabhupada's idea versus the Gaudiya Math's idea or whatever. And I've yet to hear any convincing, you know, verse or anything which excludes the possibility that the living entity could have come from a relationship with Krishna. And as we said, there's that one verse, I forget where it is, the devotee showed it to me, and it is in the Bhagavatam, where Prabhupada says that the living entity does not fall. But I believe what he means is that he doesn't fall in the sense that he imagines that he falls, but it's not a real fall. But everywhere else, Prabhupada commonly makes the idea present that we were with Krishna, we misused our independence, that for that reason we were at fault, not Krishna, we were at fault. We came here, we recognized we did the wrong thing, we're going back. And you have those verses, there's two of them. One of them is, Krishna Bahirmukha Hanya Bhogavanchakare Nikatasta Mayatare Japati Adare, that the living entity turning his face away from Krishna. The word is right there. Bahirmukha Hanya, turning his face away from Krishna. And the material energy slapping him down. There's another verse that's very similar. Krishna Hanya E Jiva Ananda Bahirmukha, or something like that. It's a similar verse. And it says pretty much the same thing. You know?
Where is that one from?
One of them is from the Brahma Vaivarta, and the other is from something else. You know, I've forgotten what the...
Well, yeah, the first one is from Jagadananda Pandit's Prema Vaivarta, I think.
Okay, so the other one is from some other location. So that's why I have never heard a convincing explanation of how, maybe there is one, and I just yet to hear it, but I've never heard a convincing explanation of how the living entity could have originally come from the Brahma-Jyoti. You know? And as for those who are incredulous, the living entity could give up a relationship with Krishna. The simple answer is that we have free will. And with free will, we can turn our face away from Krishna by wondering why Krishna always has to be at the center, which is not the same as imagining a whole decadent life in the material world. A spiritual living entity doesn't do that. Rather, he simply imagines what it would be like if it wasn't Krishna at the center, and we get the ticket to the material world. So anyway, those are a few thoughts I had about the matter.
Thank you for elaborating. There's also that verse that goes, Nitya Siddha Krishna, Prema Sadi Kabanai Shavanari Shuddha Chitte Karya Udaya, that pure love of Krishna is established in the heart of a living entity. It's not something to be gained from an outside source. When one engages in devotional service, beginning with hearing, one's consciousness becomes purified, and that love becomes manifested. So that indicates that Kaviraj Goswami in the Chaitanya Charitamrita, he's considering that we already have this love in our heart, and then so that makes it seem also not understandable that how we could be in in the Brahmajyoti if we have that love in our heart already, because there's no material thing covering it there, So it should be manifest, in which case we wouldn't be in the Brahmajyoti, And the thing about, usually it's said that people fall from the Brahmajyoti back into the material world because the soul is active by nature and it can't live in this inactive place for any length of time, and because it hasn't acquired knowledge of devotional service, all it knows is material activity, so that brings it back here. So that also makes it more difficult to understand how it could be in the Brahmajyoti, because there it wouldn't have any knowledge of material or spiritual, and it would just have a desire to do something, but it couldn't do anything for eons,
Foaming in the Brahmajyoti. There's nothing going on there.
Yeah, it's very inconceivable. So, does anybody have any questions or comments about any of these things we've talked about so far?
Well, we could talk about this, idea of reincarnation, which is, we were talking about this last night. I went to give class in New Jersey last night, and I came back. And one of the most serious problems with modern religious philosophy is this removal of the doctrine of reincarnation. That once you remove the doctrine of reincarnation, a lot of questions no longer have answers. You can't deal with them in a realistic or simple way, Now, Judaism does, at least some portion of Jews believe that there is such a thing as reincarnation. However, in Christianity and Islam, the idea is completely rejected. This is why so many things don't make sense. Why is it that God creates a material universe where some children are born in rich families? Why is it God creates a material universe where a child can be born to saintly Christian parents who give him a nurturing and bring him up realizing the glories of Jesus and of being a good Christian, and another child is born to a crack mother who is an atheist and grows up with only harsh life as his reality. How can God create such disparity, and what would be his motivation for doing it, And also a child could be born in such a way that they were, physically incapacitated, in as much as they might not be able to have proper functioning of the senses, could never get good communication from outside to learn about Christianity, or for that matter, any religion. So all these things are unanswerable questions, in general, when you remove the doctrine of reincarnation, our world starts to become totally undescribable in a basic way. Everything seems to happen for no particular reason, and especially religion seems to lose its whole merit. When you have a single life, and either at the result of the end of a single life, you either go to heaven or you go to hell, and both of those are eternal situations. So therefore, as a result of a single life, you have a result that God gives you that's eternal. A single life is a finite period of time, obviously not very long period of time, but the consequences endure eternally, and it makes God out to be some kind of monster that even the most vindictive person wouldn't want to see somebody in torment for eternity for whatever they had done. That there must be some point where the idea of punishment anyway is not in the punishment itself, but punishment is always thought of in tandem with rectification.
Right.
So if there's no rectification involved, then what's the purpose of punishment? You know, it's just vindictive. So at any rate, two of the great religions reject the concept of reincarnation. Buddhism accepts the idea of reincarnation, which is very different from our idea of reincarnation. It's a different concept altogether. As you said, you know, Ian Stevenson did all these, you know, in the University of Virginia. he had a whole research branch devoted to chronicling the explanations of young children about their previous lives. And now there's Ian Stevenson left this world about 4 or 5 years ago. There's Brian Tucker or something like that took over the thing. He's continuing. He's actually Buddhist in his philosophical and religious leanings, but he's also doing a lot of good propaganda. I think in some ways he's doing better propaganda than Ian Stevenson did. But they have this huge, you know, database of children who were interviewed about previous lifetimes. And as you say, you know, Ian Stevenson had these, he wrote a book called 20 Cases Indicative of Reincarnation.
Suggestive of
Reincarnation, right. Mm-hmm. And he talked about the fact that a person can have physical marks from their previous life, as you mentioned in class, and those also include that, you know, there was one instance of a person having been hung in a previous life, and he had some funny marks on his neck.
Wow.
And there was an instance of a young girl who had something severed her legs in a previous life, and in this life she had a funny thing around her knees. You know, it didn't keep her from walking or anything, but it was as if there's some vestige left from the previous life that's imprinted on the physical body of this life, you know. And so the idea then was that birthmarks are actually death marks of the previous lifetime, and they have something to do with that. And we see commonly that you find people with this one spot on their head, like a bullet hole or something like that, one mole on their head somewhere, usually in a place which would have been lethal, which might have indicated their previous death.
Yeah, there's some additional things. Then there'd be people who drowned who had a phobia of water, and then there was some person who lived like in a village in India, and when there was a certain other person around, it brought him great fear, and it turned out that person murdered him in the previous life, and he felt subconsciously afraid of him in the next life. He didn't know why, but that was...
Right. That's the other thing, that phobias, you know, there's no explanation for phobias in our modern world, but it seems to me it's quite easy to think that either how a person died or even the hells that they went to. Like common phobias are phobias of dogs. There's a hell where you're chewed at by dogs. Their phobias are falling off heights. There's a hell where you're pushed off great heights. There's a phobia of you know, water. You know, there's all these kinds of phobias. So why are people irrationally afraid of things that they've never experienced, but nevertheless they're terrified of them? Sometimes so much so that they become unable to function in society. And there are people now who do help people with these phobias by gradually introducing them to the thing that they're very, very terrified of in such a way that they kind of eventually get used to it. But this gets into the whole concept of past life regression, where another technique to get rid of phobias is where psychologists discover that by placing a person under hypnosis and then regressing them. Originally, the idea was in psychology to regress a person to an early portion of their life to where the neurosis or the phobia was manifest. You know, oftentimes they would find that, you know, the mother did something when the child was very, very little, and that caused a trauma to the child. And when the child remembered that through hypnosis of being that little and that thing happening, then the neurosis went away, or the phobia went away. But when they were doing this and using this as a technique, the psychologists who were hypnotizing sometimes would push the person being hypnotized too far back. And then they would start recounting a previous life. And of course, the psychologists had no idea what was going on until they got together with one another and they began to realize that numerous people were having the same phenomenon happen. That sometimes people would regress too far and they would go into previous life. And then they began to realize that this was past life regression. And they began to realize that some phobias don't start with this life, or some neuroses don't start with this life. They have their root in a previous life, which is again another evidence of reincarnation, that a person can be regressed and you know, have the experience of a previous life, and by revisiting that experience of a previous life, they can finally be done with it and move on into this life completely. And that brings another curious phenomenon, and that is that there's Peter Ramster and other people did these previous life regressions, and sometimes when people go into a previous lifetime, they're speaking a different language, a language that they don't know in their present life, you know, which is very strange. How do you explain that? And what's even more strange is that when people are regressed into a previous lifetime, they sometimes speak versions of languages that most people, even of that language, don't know in the like Old French or some kind of language that they have to have a specialist who can speak a strange dialect that's no longer even spoken anywhere in the world to be able to. Yeah, right. So how and why would a person be able to suddenly speak, you know, and you can see them doing that. Actually, there's a funny part where, and I think that there's a common doctor that does this, you know. He had this Chinese interpreter, and the lady that was being regressed was not Chinese, she was Western. But when she was being regressed, she would suddenly start speaking Chinese. So they had a Chinese interpreter there who was interpreting the Chinese. And so you see that there's even another weirder thing, that in one episode of regressing somebody to a previous lifetime, they asked this lady, you know, to point out on a map where, you know, she had been born in a previous life in France, you know. So she looked at the map, and in her, you know, regression, she pointed the spot, you know. And then when she came out of the regression, they asked her if she remembered where she pointed on the map. And they handed the map to her, and she says, "I can't see that." She had to get her glasses. You know?
Wow.
So, you know, somehow she was able to see it without needing glasses while she was under, you know, past life regression. But the minute that she came out of the regression, she needed glasses again.
Wow.
You know? So these are very peculiar phenomenon, and the simplest way to explain them all is that there is such a thing as a subtle body. There is such a thing as going from one lifetime to another. There is such a thing that the soul, in some way or another, remembers all the events of past lifetimes. They're not common, they can't be brought up. If you think about them, you can't just call them to mind. but under the proper circumstances, one can be brought back, and experience these things. And so this is certainly evidence for reincarnation. This is actually scientific evidence. That's what, Ian Stevenson proposed. He said that as far as science goes, this is science. We are, we're interrogating these small children. They're giving these accounts. Then we go down through historical records and see if we can corroborate these accounts. Many of them can be corroborated. So, what's the basis upon which to reject this? And there isn't any basis to reject it, other than people are just stone prejudiced against the idea that there could be such a thing as reincarnation. Of course, Christians are prejudiced against it because it's not in their theology, and atheists are prejudiced against it because they claim that there's nothing other than the body. So both have a reason to reject the idea, but neither of those reasons are scientific.
Right.
They're rather just the evidence of a prejudice.
There's an interesting, in the Origins magazine, of course, there's discussion of reincarnation, and there's a study where they interview people from 4 different Christian denominations, and about ranging between 23 and 28% of each of them, they believe in reincarnation, even though it's not part of their scripture, because it makes so much sense.
Right. There are Christians that believe in reincarnation. There are Christians who won't eat meat too.
Yeah.
So there's a vegetarian Christian movement, believe it or not.
Well, the Seventh-day Adventists don't eat meat.
Well, not just that. There's
Right.
a whole movement that, although they're definitely Christians, they believe that eating meat is wrong somehow, which is interesting. And one final point is that, there was a story, actually it's a book called Soul Survivor, and it's spelled S-O-L-E, Survivor. And it's about the Leninger family, who the wife was Catholic and the husband was Protestant religion, Christians, both of them. And they had a young boy, and the young boy started having these nightmares, really intense nightmares every night. He was about 4 or 5 years old or something like that. And they discovered after talking to the young boy that his nightmares were about being shot down as a fighter pilot in World War II in Japan. And so this was James Leninger, the boy, and he remembered a past life as a fighter pilot in World War II. And when they brought him, one time to an Air Force base, he was, this was Texas. They lived for a while in Louisiana, then they moved to Texas, or it was the other way around, I don't remember. And they brought him to a place, and he did what looked like a pre-flight inspection on the airplane, as a little boy. There's a little video of him, looking at it just the way that pilots do, and he had never studied, aircraft design, or how would he know how pilots would do a pre-flight aircraft inspection in World War II. What kind of information could that little boy have gotten, And so not only was that there, but eventually as they interviewed the boy, the father wanted to disprove the idea. So the father began to do research on what the boy said. And the boy said that he had been a fighter pilot, and his ship that he took off from the aircraft carrier was called the Natoma Bay. So father said, Natoma, that sounds Japanese, and the boy made this sour face. He says, no, it's American. And actually there was a Natoma Bay. And the boy claimed to fly a Corsair, which is not a usual kind of aircraft that was used in World War II. There were some Corsairs used, but the particular, the other planes were much more common. So how he would pull that name out. And then he began to name the people in his squadron, and eventually the father, he had so much of this information, he discovered that the Natoma Bay reunion group meets every year in California. So he flew out there, and he told the group that he was doing a book on American fighter pilots. So they told him all this stuff, and he asked the people in that association if they knew someone who was named. The boy's name was John Leninger. The family's name was Leninger. But before that, he had a different name. I've forgotten what his name was before he was reincarnated. And all the people in that group knew the person. And the way that the little boy told him that he had died was what they understood is what was how that person had met his end. Wow. So all this connected. And eventually the father winds up proving reincarnation to himself rather than disproving it, even though the mother didn't have so much problem with it. Even though she was Catholic, she kind of said, well, it must be reincarnation. Reincarnation is not in the Catholic religion either, but she accepted it, but the father went through all this long stuff, and eventually he had to concede that the only reasonable thing to come across with was that this boy actually was reincarnated. There was a television station or a television reporter who was from India, and she decided she wanted to do a story on this boy. So she did it, and when it came to air, the network canceled it. It was ABC. But later it aired on YouTube. It's up there if you're interested in seeing it, the Leninger family. And then they came to write a book about it. And eventually NHK, the Japanese television station, found out about the story since it was World War II. And they invited the family over to where that it actually happened in Chichijima, which is a part of Japan, it's one of those islands out there. And, they did a translation of the whole story into Japanese, and then the little boy is out there in a boat about the place where the aircraft went down, and suddenly the boy just goes completely, he starts crying uncontrollably, and he throws a bouquet of flowers at that spot right where there's a strange protrusion from the water where, he recalled his aircraft crashing, and he sees the protrusion, and, after that point, then the nightmares stopped, and he kind of moved into his present life, and so anyway, that's the whole story, that you have this vivid recollection of a previous life in a family where the people didn't believe in reincarnation, and all these details that could not have been known by the child in any reasonable way. Obscure things that only a person who had been in World War II would know, So the only option is to think, how could this child have come by this information? So this builds a strong case for reincarnation. And actually, as you say, many people believe in reincarnation these days, even if officially their religion rejects it.
Well, I guess it's time to continue with our next program. Thank you for giving me those additional details. I knew some about that case, but not all of it.
Yeah, it's the Leninger family. I think the father's name is John Leninger, and the boy's name is James Leninger. There are several accounts of children remembering vividly past lives, and there's some other things. If you Google out reincarnation, you'll see some of these stories.
So we can end here and continue next verse next day. Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai.